Hello everyone, welcome to another Random Talk Sunday, and today I'm going to be briefly addressing the latest film that is within the Bond franchise, Spectre. Um, I thought it would be interesting, at least throughout this time of year when all of these movies are coming out, in particular fairly well recognized films. At least this year, not only do we have a new Bond film, but we also have a new Star Wars film. So it's a very big year for movies, and I did briefly touch on this throughout the summer and have looked into films that are sort of being presented that seem a little bit larger than life than maybe some other years where I felt like the films were sort of more hit and miss. So yeah, without further ado though, let me address this film in particular. Now, Spectre is a very interesting film to say the least. I mean, it is technically Daniel Craig's last Bond film, at least according to him. I don't believe he wants to do any more after this particular film. But we'll see. Maybe there will be something that'll change that. But I think that's probably not going to be the case, especially with the way they play out this film. They almost make it sort of like it's at least his part of playing Bond is like coming sort of full circle. So I don't know if they could really do anything necessarily all too new by utilizing him as Bond. So this may or may not be the last one, but I'm assuming it is from what I've heard as far as social media is concerned. Now, I don't really like to compare to previous installments of other Bond films because, again, they're all fairly different, and obviously there's going to be a preference. Some people don't like Daniel Craig as James Bond. They think he's too dark, um, too serious. I personally enjoy the approach, and I enjoy the other styles of Bond where he's a little bit more charismatic, a little bit more suave. Even though Daniel Craig is suave to a certain extent, he's not as, I would say, charming. He's not the kind of charmer type Bond that I think we've come to know, at least from other actors, in particular Sean Connery and whatnot. So this is obviously Daniel Craig as James Bond. So if you're not a particular fan of the Daniel Craig films of James Bond, then you're probably not going to gravitate to this film. It's definitely not going to win you over. But when I look at all of the Daniel Craig films, as far as from what I can tell, I still feel that Skyfall probably outdoes this film as far as its, I think, overall engagement and its overall story and its presentation. But this one I think is still a nice follow-up. I mean, it does offer some interesting things. Again, I think some things were a little bit underutilized, or maybe not utilized as correctly as at least within my eyes, but it's definitely still a good follow-up. This is nowhere near, it's not Quantum of Solace territory here. So I think that's something that I think a lot of people could appreciate, considering the fact that that particular film, at least within the Daniel Craig Bonds, is the one that's considered to be the kind of dud. So that's important to note. This is, at least from my point of view, this film is definitely one that is on the more more higher quality side. But basically, this film largely and primarily revolves around trying to kind of, again, create at least bring the Daniel Craig films sort of full circle. Because a lot of the things that have happened within the previous films are sort of part of what ends up occurring within this film. So you'll kind of see how a lot of the events that have happened within the previous films ultimately lead to um, an ultimate foe, which is this organization called Spectre, hence the title, and also the villain who's involved with this, played by none other than Christoph Waltz, who does a pretty amazing job for being a crazy uh, lunatic. But um, as far as what this film does very well, and again, I don't really want to give too much away of plot. That's really ultimately all I can really say about it. Is that primarily James Bond's enemy is this organization, and in particular the villain Christoph Waltz, who is technically in charge of that whole organization. And a lot of what that organization has done has uh, related to a lot of the again, all of the previous films that have involved Daniel Craig playing James Bond. But as far as the good stuff that's within this film, the action sequences are really well done. There is a lot of style to them. There's a lot of substance. You really do feel like they put a lot of work and time and energy into devoting to the action sequences. They feel very fast paced. They feel, kind of almost on the more realistic side, in the sense that, that you don't feel like it's very overblown like some other action films are. So there's a lot of style and a lot of interesting things that they do with the action sequences, and there's a lot of variety. There's hand to hand, there's shooting, there's fights on a helicopter, um, buildings come crashing down in the opening scene, or at least one of the opening scenes of the film. So there is a lot that this film has to offer as far as action. And also sometimes within that action, there also comes a little bit of comedy. And I think actually that comedy sort of works. And I feel like it sort of resembles onto the whole kind of setting in which James Bond is in, because you'll see how eventually a Fiat comes into the picture when he's in Rome. And I think that just works because, you feel like it's very European. You feel like it's trying to sort of present itself in that format and commenting on things that you would probably come to expect from the settings that he's in particular, that where there's a Fiat car involved. But also, I think, again, like I've said before with the plot and how it comes full circle, I really did like that approach. I think that was a good way of sort of tying things together, because a lot of the times you don't see that with a lot of Bond films. They don't really tie in together. They just kind of go from one thing to the next and one storyline to the next. So to see this kind of to see this film take like a full circle approach, I think was definitely one that worked to the film's advantage. Um, and it was overall, I think, developed fairly well. And the villain also is fairly good, Christoph Waltz. Now, I would say he is a bit, almost, I think, a little bit underutilized, because we don't see him in the majority of this film. He's not really present until like the middle and then the end. So I felt that was a little bit on the side of not so much that he wasn't a good villain, as more so as he wasn't really on screen all too much. And on the one hand, I really did enjoy his performance. On the other hand, again, I don't think he was there all too much, and I think that's it's a very discouraging part of the film, because especially when you want to hype up that this villain um, is really what brings the whole kind of part of that James Bond franchise full circle. It is kind of underwhelming. That was, I think, a huge disappointment and letdown for me, because I was going, really? He's only in this for like not even the majority of the film, or at least a good chunk of the film. Like, he's just there at certain points. Like, I felt he was not as utilized. Again, I think still Javier Bardem's character, um, I think is still probably the superior villain because, again, he got more screen time, he got more exposure, I think, overall. And um, I think that just played better with his character, and he actually does end up causing a significant amount of damage because he does ultimately end up killing somebody, and somebody that's really important to the film, the whole franchise, really. And Christoph Waltz really doesn't do that. So it's kind of, when you want to really make a threatening villain and a villain that really is designed to be, um, a genuine threat, and I mean, really the ultimate threat, because again, this series tries to go full circle with the whole franchise. It's a bit underwhelming when you're not, fully bringing that character to the forefront. And unfortunately, Christoph Waltz is in that category. So again, I think not putting him up on screen that much was really something that deterred my personal enjoyment of the film, really. Because I think a lot of people were hyped to see Christoph Waltz. And again, he is in this movie. It's not that he's not in the movie. It's just, he's not really there all that much. And when he's there, he gives a good performance. It's just he just doesn't feel at the forefront, especially when you don't really see him until, again, sort of the last fourth of the movie. So that's something I think that is important to note. And also, there's some other parts of this film that I think were a little bit underwhelming as well. And again, I'm not trying to be nitpicky here, but I am looking at this film as how it stands as a whole. And I think there were parts of the plot that I think created some underwhelmment as well. And it's not only just the villain, but in particular, this film hyped up the fact that I think her name is Monica Bellucci, who's supposed to be, I think, an Italian actress, that she was supposed to play a role within this film, and she's not utilized at all. She's just a plot device. Like, she is not a character whatsoever. Like, Bond just asks for some information from her, pretty much, and then some other things, but that's it. Like, she is not part of this movie, really, at all. So I think that was a big sort of letdown, because if you're hyping up that this person's supposed to be within the film and then you don't use that person, really, it's not really, it doesn't really send I think, a good message. Also, parts in which this plot are overall, at least its overall execution, like, I like certain parts of it, and some of the certain parts that they do with it are brilliant. And then there's other parts where I'm just kind of going, could have this been done in another way? I would have appreciated had they done certain things that were within the plot. In particular with the climax and the conclusion, I thought was a little bit underwhelming. Again, it's not disappointing, like, no, why did you do that? But it's kind of like, if you're going for that, I mean, yeah, I would have done that a little bit differently. I just kind of look at it and go, not what I would have done, but okay. So, again, despite those kinds of parts that, again, I've mentioned before, overall, I still think it is satisfying in the sense that it is smart. There are a lot of clever moments within this film. There's a lot of things that sort of tie together and do ultimately work for a James Bond film. But, I think there's just there's just like certain parts of it that I think are what make it a little bit underwhelming, as far as, or at least not as, I guess, fulfilling or at least satisfying as something like Skyfall. And I think that primarily has to do with, again, parts of the plot, not utilizing certain things that really needed to be, I think, utilized. And that's why I think, even though this film has a lot of good things in it, there's also still some things that I felt were a little bit not as, again, they just weren't explored. They weren't done in the way that I would have executed them. And as a result, I think that diminishes the overall experience. And I think that partially has to do with the fact that, again, Skyfall was such a well done Bond that I think this one in particular was hard to top. But I think they could have done it had they, again, made some changes and had they focused more on utilizing certain characters and certain parts of the plot. So I think that's really my biggest gripes. But overall, it's still really well done. It feels very classy. It feels very it feels a lot like a Bond film. Overall, all of the characters are fairly likable and interesting to watch. And there's a lot of good performances as well. So again, I think there is a its overall presentation is good and well executed. But when you look into the finer details, at least ones that I think are important details, you'll probably see, at least from what my perspective is I think you'll see parts that are a little bit not as well produced as other Bond films. So this is kind of in the middle for me. I mean, I would definitely say this is probably the second best within the Daniel Craig lineup of Bond films. And again, I hate to compare, but I mean, you almost have to because I mean, these films are technically all supposed to be tied together. And if you tie them together in this way, I mean, I think again, what they did with it was good. But again, there's just some other parts that just feel like, ooh, just why would you do that? I don't understand why you would do that. So yeah, I think though that's really all I can say about it without really again giving too much away. I don't really want to spoil anything for the plot. All you really need to know going in is that Christoph Waltz is the villain and that he's the leader of this organization called Spectre that has some influence as to what has previously happened to all of the other um, events that exist within the other Bond films, in particular, just the ones with Daniel Craig as Bond. So that's all you really need to know. But yeah, I think that's really all I can say. If there are any questions, comments, concerns, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Also, I should mention just briefly about this film before I stop talking about it. There is a part of this film that I do like in which that it explores the topic of surveillance and the impact of technology and how that's drastically uh, making the whole process of having these sort of secret agents um, uh, go out in the field differently than what has been done again in the past. Like you'll see at one point how they're able to really spy on Bond by just inserting a little nano, I guess you could technically call it some kind of nano chip inside of him, so they can tell, like they can see how healthy he is and where he is in the world. Um, and this whole kind of surveillance angle I thought was very interesting and provides a lot of commentary because that is, I think, very reflective onto what's going on right now, especially with the huge amounts of advancement that we've made with technology. I mean, that was, I think, a brilliant thing to touch upon, and you'll see how Spectre sort of applies to that surveillance angle. So again, though, that's, I think, ultimately though all I can say about this film, again, without giving really too much away. However, if there are any questions, comments, concerns, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you all have a pleasant day, week, month, and year, and hopefully see you all next video. Take care. Bye-bye.